Atlantis is not a myth is a popular science article from 1879 written by Edward Thompson, the man who bought Chichen Itza for 300 pesos. Before he made his way to Chichen Itza, he explained his point of view of Atlantis by connecting many topics like the 10,000-year-old copper mines in the Great Lakes regions, ancient knowledge of the Americas, and who were the Mound Builders. Atlantis is not a myth by Edward H. Thompson. Our sturdy worker in the copper mines of Lake Superior, finding both himself and his vein of copper growing poorer day by day, determines to seek some more paying claim in the in as yet unexplored portion of the copper country. He gathers his kit of tools together and starts, and after many a hard hour's travel over the wild and rugged country, finds a region with abundant signs of copper, and where seemingly no human foot has trod since the creation's dawn. He strikes a rich vein and goes steadily to work, digging and blasting his way to the richer portions, when suddenly, right in the richest part, he finds his lead cut off by what looks to his experienced eye marvelously like a mining shaft. Amazedly, he begins to clear out of the pit the fallen earth and the debris of ages, and the daylight thus let in reveals to his astonished gaze an immense mass of copper raised. Some distance from the original bottom of the pit on a platform of logs, while at his feet lie a number of strange stone and copper implements, some thin and sharp like knives and hatchets, others huge and blunt like maws and hammers, all being left in such a manner as though the workman had just gone to dinner and might be expected back at any moment. Bewildered, he ascends to the surface again and looks about him. He sees mounds that from their positions are evidently formed from the refuse of the pit, but these mounds are covered with gigantic trees, evidently the growth of centuries. And looking still closer, he sees that these trees are fed from the decayed ruins of still older trees that have sprung up, flourished, grown old, and died since this pit was dug or these mounds were raised. The more he thinks of the vast ages that have elapsed since the pit was dug, that mass of copper quarried and raised, the more confused he becomes. His mind cannot grasp this immensity of time. Who were these miners? When did they live? And where did they come from? Are the questions he asks himself but gets no answer. However, one fact is patent to him that whoever they are, whoever they were, they will not now trouble his claim, and consoled by this reflection, he goes to work again. The traveler in wandering through the dense and almost impenetrable forests of Central and South America suddenly finds himself upon a broad and well-paved road, but a road over which in places there have grown trees centuries old. Curiously following this road, he sees before him, as though brought thither by some Aladdin's lamp, a vast city, a city built of stone, buildings that look at a distance like our large New England factories, splendid palaces and aqueducts, all constructed with such massiveness and grandeur as to compel a cry of astonishment from the surprised traveler. An immense but deserted city whose magnificent palaces and beautiful sculpturing are inhabited and viewed only by the iguana and centipede. The roads and paths to the aqueducts, once so much traveled as to have worn hollows in the hard stone, are now trodden only by the ignorant mestizo or simple Indian. Of this deserted home of a lost race, the traveler asks the same question as the miner, and the only answer he gets from the semi-civilized Indian is a laconic "Quien sabe?" and "Who does know?" The curious and scientific world, however, are not so easily answered, and various are the theories and conjectures as to these diggers of mines and builders of mounds in strange cities. One of the most plausible of these, one believed by many scientists to be the true theory, is this: ages ago, the Americas presented a very different appearance from what they now do. Then an immense peninsula extended itself from Mexico, Central America, and New Granada so far into the Atlantic that Madeira, the Azores, and the West India Islands are now fragments of it. This peninsula was a fair and fertile country inhabited by rich and civilized nations, a people versed in the arts of war and civilization, a country covered with large cities and magnificent palaces. Their rulers, according to tradition, reigning not only on the Atlantic continent, but over islands far and near, even into Europe and Asia. Suddenly, without warning, this whole fair land was engulfed by sea in a mighty convulsion of nature. Not only is it within the bounds of possibility that it might have occurred, but if traditions so clear and distinct as to be almost authentic history are to be believed, then it did occur. Listen to what one of the most cautious of ancient writers, Plato, says. Among the great deeds of Athens, of which recollection is preserved in our books, there is one that should be placed above all others. Our book tells us that the Athenians destroyed an army that came across the Atlantic seas and insolently invaded Europe and Asia. For this sea was then navigable, and beyond the straits where you place the Pillars of Hercules was an immense island, larger than Asia and Libya combined. From this island one could pass easily to the other islands, and from these to the continent beyond. The sea on this side of the straits resembled a harbor with a narrow entrance, but there is a veritable sea, and the land which surrounds it is a veritable continent. On this island of Atlantis there reigned three kings with great and marvelous power. They had under their domain the whole of Atlantis, several of the other islands, and part of the continent. At one time their power extended into Europe as far as Turania, and uniting their whole force they sought to destroy our country at a blow. But their defeat stopped the invasion and gave entire freedom to the countries this side of the Pillars of Hercules. Afterward, in one day and one fatal night, there came mighty earthquakes and inundations that engulfed that warlike people. Atlantis disappeared, and then that sea became inaccessible on account of the vast quantities of mud that the engulfed island left in its place. It's possible that the debris said to have been left by this catastrophe might be identical with or the nuclei of the Sargasso fields that, many centuries later, Columbus found almost impenetrable. Again, Plato, in an extract from Proclus, speaks of an island in the Atlantic whose inhabitants preserved knowledge from their ancestors of a large island in the Atlantic, which had dominion over all other islands of this sea. The situation, the description of the country, in fact, every particular agrees precisely with our idea of Atlantis. And what other land now in existence agrees in any way with this description? What islands of magnitude that contain navigable rivers, large, fertile plains, and mountains? Turning from our well-known ancient writers, we find in all the traditions and books of the ancient Central Americans and Mexicans a continual recurrence to the fact of an awful catastrophe, similar to that mentioned by Plato and others. Now, what are we to believe? This, that either the traditions and narratives of these ancient writers and historians of both lands are but a tissue of fabrications evolved from their own brains with perhaps a small thread of fact, or else that they are truths, and truths proving that the Americas, instead of being the youngest habitation of man, are among the oldest, if not, as Deborah Berg affirms, the oldest. Of all that populous land, naught remains save fuming, seething mud. It is not to be supposed that all perished in that calamity. Long before this, they had spread over the portion of the Americas contiguous to the peninsula, building cities, palaces, roads, and aqueducts like those of their native homes, and adventurous pioneers continually spreading north, east, and westward, their constant increase of numbers from their former homes enabling them to overcome the resistance offered to their progress by both native and nature, till at last they reach and discover the copper country of Lake Superior. That they appreciated this discovery is evinced by the innumerable evidences of their works and of their skill in discovering the richest and most promising veins. Wherever our miners of the present day go, they find their ancient fellow craftsmen have been before them, working the richest veins and gathering the best copper. And it is supposed that they continued thus till the terrible blotting out of their native country cut short all this, and left this advancing civilization to wither and die like a vine severed from the parent system. Having no further accession to their numbers and being continually decimated by savages and disease, they slowly retreated before the ever advancing hordes, gradually and contesting every step, as is shown by their numerous defensive works along their path. They were forced back to their cities on this continent that had been spared them from the universal destruction of their country, where the dense and almost impassable forests afforded them their last refuge from their enemies, and where, reduced by war, pestilence, and other causes to a feeble band, their total extinction was only a matter of time. Such is probably the history of this lost civilization, and such would have been the history of our civilization had we and our infant growth been cut off from receiving the nourishment of the mother countries. He goes on to explain how the old theories were thrown away and replaced with the theories of his time that have since also been thrown away and replaced with newer theories. Atlantis is not a myth. Explained the link between the copper mines, Atlantis, and the native cultures. He also answered the questions of what happened to the Atlanteans, is America the old world, and he suggested that the Sargasso fields were the reason that ships could not pass the Atlantic before 1492. This article made him famous, and I'll follow up with a video on what he did next. So what do you think? Did he make a good case for Atlantis? Leave a message and let me know. Thanks for listening.